All right. Good evening, good day, everybody, and welcome to this topical webinar that's presented by NiPERA, which is the science branch of the Nickel Institute. So my name is Chris Schlekat, and I am the executive director of NiPERA, and I'm coming to you from Durham, North Carolina in the United States. This is the third in a series of webinars that we have introduced to the Indonesian nickel value chain. And the subject of today's event is the science of nickel from human health and environmental perspectives. So we know how important nickel production is in Indonesia, and the aim of today's webinar is to share our more than 40 years of experience working on nickel human health and environmental science, as this is a critical component in the responsible use of this important element. So we have a relatively short period of time today, so we'll be providing only an introduction to what it is that we do. And hopefully we'll have more opportunities in the future to get into more details. So I'll be joined by my colleagues within NiPERA, and by a special guest whom we'll introduce shortly. So before going on, here are some points about webinar protocols. So first of all, you are all muted, which is necessary for the number of participants we have to avoid background noise. And second, if you have questions for particular speakers or in general, please enter them in the Q&A tab, which is at the bottom of your dashboard. And don't try to use the chat feature for this. This has been disabled. So we'll try to answer as many questions as we can, and we'll follow up afterwards if we do not get the chance. And then third, we have translation capabilities that are under the language tab. Maybe I'll just give everybody a couple of seconds to try that out and make sure that you're able to engage that. And while you're doing that, I'll just mention that this webinar is being recorded. So the previous topical webinars are available on the Nickel Institute YouTube page, and we will also make this one available in the future. All right, and hopefully by now that you've been able to engage the interpretation opportunities. So now, as we do for all Nickel Institute events, I want to remind everybody about the Nickel Institute's antitrust policy, which we in NiPERA adhere to. So we have a lot of information on our website concerning this important policy, but for now, I just want to emphasize that most importantly, that we do not present forecasts or comments on nickel markets, prices, or supply and demand, other than descriptive information. So now just a little bit of background information about the Nickel Institute. So we are a global association of leading nickel producers, and we're a diverse organization. So we address nickel from science, public policy, sustainability, market development, and communication perspectives. And our fundamental goal in these areas is to keep markets open for nickel. So all of the divisions of the Nickel Institute act to support a shared mission, which is to advocate for the responsible supply of nickel and the sustainable development of the nickel industry. So we do this in 4 areas. So first of all, we invest in scientific research, the results of which can then be used to advocate for sensible policy decisions that affect nickel and nickel markets. Then in terms of market development, on the lower left-hand side of this slide, We work in a strategic way to ensure that the beneficial characteristics of nickel are recognized in appropriate applications. And then finally, our communication department works to make invisible nickel visible so that its role in society is broadly recognized. So where in the world do our activities take place? Well, literally all over. So my NiPERA colleagues and I are coming to you from Durham, North Carolina in the United States. And this is one of the two major offices of the Nickel Institute. And our other large office is in Brussels, Belgium. And we have smaller offices and presences in Canada, China, Japan, Singapore, and Australia as well. So here is today's program. And we're very pleased to have Dr. Ali Sahami of Merdeka Battery Minerals speak about community and environmental awareness from the perspective of nickel mining in Indonesia. So we'll then have a series of short presentations by my NiPERA colleagues, including Doctors Samuel Buxton, Emily Garman, and Kate Heim. And they'll speak about basic information regarding nickel human health, the environment, and community exposure and risk assessment. And what we hope to do then is have all of our speakers address questions that we receive from the audience through the Q&A feature, and I'll facilitate this discussion. So this is your chance to become part of the program, and we hope you take advantage of that. But first, I want to just talk very briefly about some basic information regarding nickel. So where does it come from? Where is it used? And why are we focusing on Indonesia today? And then I'll just close by saying a couple of things about why Nickel Institute companies invest in scientific research. So if we take a look at global nickel production, and this is from the year 2022, so we'll look at first use, end use, targeted sectors, and when doing this, we can find some important generalizations. So first of all, in 2022, approximately 3.2 million tons were produced. And we see that a vast majority of this came from lateritic ores. And this represents a huge shift in terms of historical production, where in the past, the majority came from sulfidic ore. And this is an important distinction in terms of our scientific approach for things like human health effects and environmental effects as well. So another shift that we see in primary nickel production is that about half ends up in NPI. So this is nickel pig iron. So a much smaller percentage is now comprised of class 1 nickel metal. So now I'll cover first use and end use in the next two slides. So in terms of first use, some change has occurred here also, but the vast majority of nickel is still used in alloys like nickel-containing stainless steel. So the battery sector has steadily increased, and in 2022 it represented about 17% of global nickel production. And as you know, this trend is expected to continue, and is one of the reasons that I'm sure that we're all here today. So then the question is, well, where does this nickel go in terms of consumer markets? Well, in terms of end uses, the largest market is consumer goods like food processing. And this includes industrial scale food processing, but also smaller scales like the forks and spoons that consumers buy. And transport is increasing from the role of batteries and electric vehicles, but it is used in other areas as well. So now, of course, we all know that, that Indonesia has become critically important in terms of global nickel production. So, and as you can see from this slide, Indonesia's production has been steadily increasing. And as of 2023, Indonesia accounted for greater than 50% of global production. And this trend is widely expected to continue, and expect this, this dominance to continue as well. But it's really important to consider that this dominance has taken a relatively short amount of time to become manifest, to occur. So one of the reasons that we want to share our experience with you is so that we can also learn from you about what it is that your experiences are, the questions that you have, so that we can all share our knowledge together with the goal of sustainable global nickel production. So as I mentioned earlier, the members of the Nickel Institute and NiPERA have been investing in scientific research on nickel for a long time, for over 40 years. So we have a lot of information. And why has this been? Why has this investment taken place? So there are three core areas where the scientific data that we produce is used in ways that benefit our member companies. So first, we work to ensure that health classifications for nickel are science-based. In many parts of the world, health classifications for chemicals like nickel and for certain endpoints like cancer or reproductive toxicity can lead to restrictions. So this essentially will eliminate those substances from certain markets. So we want to make sure that any decision like that is based upon the latest and accurate scientific information. So secondly, workplace and environmental standards are set by regulatory communities for nickel, again, literally around the world. So we are involved in these processes to ensure that standards are based on appropriate scientific data, so that they do offer the desired level of protection on the one hand, and are achievable on the other hand. And this is particularly important for a naturally occurring substance like nickel, because it cannot be eliminated completely. And then finally, we're increasingly seeing areas in ESG reporting where our data comes into play. So we want to offer the entire nickel value chain the opportunity to collaborate with us on providing science-based solutions to the broad needs of wide ranges of stakeholders in this area. So I'll end my brief presentation by offering a glimpse into what we do in NiPERA. So first and foremost, we are all PhD level scientists. And in that regard, we are responsible for creating scientific data on nickel. So one of the things that we do is to manage projects, manage research projects, and then we also seek to communicate the outcome of our research to a range of stakeholders, including governments, industry, and to the public. So, and as you'll see, we in some of the later slides, we produce guidance on how to use nickel safely. And I think it's safe to say that the guidance that we generate on nickel is more thorough and offers more experience than probably any other source. And then finally, we publish our work in the scientific literature. So this helps us establish our credibility as a scientific organization. And I'm just showing three examples of recent publications on the right, where my NiPERA colleagues who are speaking later are the first author. We have many, many, many more publications. And if you're interested, you can visit our website and find out more about that. So that is my introduction to today's event. And with that, we will transition to our keynote speaker. And again, I'll let Emily make some changes here to give our guest speaker the controls. So our guest speaker is Dr. Ali Sahami, and Ali is the Director of Sustainability of Merdeka Battery Minerals. And he is going to share his insight in a presentation titled Nickel Mining in Indonesian Community and Environmental Awareness. And then he'll also join us for our discussion later in the program. So thank you very much, and Ali, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you for NiPERA and the Nickel Institute for the invitation to speak at this event. As Chris mentioned, I'm head of sustainability for the Merdeka group, which are Indonesian mining group, and consisting of various different subsidiaries. I'm going to be talking on behalf of Merdeka Battery Materials, which is the nickel side of our business. And just as an introduction, we all are aware and are on the pressures and expectations on Indonesian nickel. We know that there is a negative perception regarding Indonesian nickel globally, some of it fair, some of it exaggerated, but it's something I think we need to accept and acknowledge as an industry and work towards meeting those high expectations which all the stakeholders in this battery business are requiring now, understandably. And part of that we certainly see in Indonesia is increased regulatory focus on environmental social performance, basically ESG. We're seeing this in Indonesia. The country, the government is aware of needing the world demand on responsible production of nickel from an environmental, social, and governance perspective. So we're seeing that in Indonesia in higher levels of scrutiny from government organization. We're all aware of investor expectations from an ESG significantly increasing, especially focused on nickel compared to relatively other metals because of the increasing use of it in the battery supply chain. Markets where our customers are, we know the EOMs, the car makers, the battery makers are wanting much more stringent sustainability practices, approaches. And finally, there's international trade platforms, LME, EU battery pass, things that are coming that are going to be very much influencing our access to market. So in short, there is in-country higher expectations on ESG, higher performance on ESG is expected from investors. So it affects our access to capital. It affects our access to markets. And if we want to be part of that global supply chain, then we recognize that although these are not mandatory, they're becoming pretty much obligatory if we want to be in a core of that business. Okay, so, oops, I jumped a couple. Action was a bit slow. Okay, so briefly, how do we do that? So the requirements now for the nickel value chain, they're becoming more global standard certification bodies that go much more beyond compliance. I think most people would be aware of these sort of international certifications, which a lot of the investors as well as the customers are requiring companies to adopt. Nickel Mark, the responsible mineral assurance, which applies to processing, IRMA, which is now applying to mine sites, but soon to be expanded to processing facilities. So I think these requirements are, and these are much more stringent sort of international certifications that will give that assurance and improve credibility for our products on the global market. And to remove this stigma associated with the poor ESG performance of Indonesian nickel. I think it's something that, although not mandatory, they're becoming pretty much obligatory if we want to be in that world market. And much more focus on stakeholder inclusivity and engagement. In Indonesia, we have a lot of regulations, a lot of it require mandatory stakeholder engagement, consultation, but really these other international standards take that to a whole new level. Much more engagement, much more consultation. So it really is, these standards are an opportunity for us to assess. They're not easy to achieve. Everyone has to assess it for their own situation. But I think these are the tools that we can use as an industry as a whole to try to meet those global expectations on ESG requirements for our products. So very briefly, I won't go into details, but our business is a vertically integrated portfolio that we acquired 2 years ago. It involves a nickel laterite mine in Sulawesi that produces both saprolite and limonite. We also have a acid production plant that actually doesn't use elemental sulfur, but uses pyrite from one of our copper mines, which is hosted in massive sulfides. So that has a double advantage for us, that we're removing a potentially acid-generating environmental liability from a site and generating acid, sulfuric acid, that then is used in HPAL operations. So our limonite feeds HPALs, our saprolite feeds RKEFs, and we have also a converter, so the RKEFs can switch between NPI and low-grade nickel matte, and we also have a converter that which converts it to a high-grade nickel matte. And and the light blue, lime blue, is more ambitions of our downstream plans. Those are not in place yet, but we're in advanced stages with third-party HPAL plants. We have 3 in the works, 1 in construction, 1 in permitting, and 1 in the feasibility. So the point of this is, us as a company, we're pretty much exposed to all ESG perspectives across the value chain, from the mining side through the processing, ultimately ending in sort of more downstream products as we go. Again, briefly, Merdeka's sustainability strategy is built on 2 foundations of respecting human rights and safe and ethical operations. Those are our foundational pillars. Responsible mineral resource, that's really how we run our business from an environmental, social governance perspective. Sustainable, resilient value chain, that's basically how we deal with our value chain, our expectations of our suppliers, our business partners, our contractors. And finally, is how we contribute to that global low carbon transition. And that's a very high level, and very similar to other other nickel companies, our colleagues. Our material topics would be very similar, because we have very similar issues facing us in Indonesia. Elements within environment, social, and governance. And this is just a brief one. There's a lot to talk about, obviously, underneath each. But for today, given the topic of NiPERA's talk, I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the main issues we face and potential opportunities in Indonesia regarding deforestation and biodiversity loss. That's a major focus from an environmental perspective in Indonesia. Impact on aquatic resources and ecology. And finally, impacts on human health. So from a deforestation and biodiversity, there are certain facts that are common to most of us in Indonesia. By nature, nickel laterite deposits, we have a large footprint. Unlike hard rock open pits, which are much more vertical, this is shallow, relatively superficial mining. So we impact a large area of land just due to the nature of laterite deposits. Indonesian forests, as everyone knows, are typically biodiverse, extensive number of endangered protected species and critical habitats. So by clearing large areas of land, we're obviously impacting all of that. And ultramafic soils, typically not as productive in Indonesia if people have worked in other areas, volcanic soils, and the relative productivity of those, reclamation, etc., is more challenging in nickel laterite areas than it is in other areas, which are extremely fertile and productive. So those are the main challenges that most of us face, certainly. Now, the opportunities and how we can do things better is, although the area of the footprint is large, unlike hard rock, open pit, deep open pits, we are able to progressively reclaim, reforest as we go behind us. So we can start that reforestation process, a revegetation process much quicker than others. So that's an opportunity that although we impact a larger area, we're able to reclaim it much more quickly behind us as we mine areas out. Obviously, companies have their own biodiversity standards and policies, no net loss or net gain, depending on the situation. It's very important for companies to have those and implement them. Obviously, biodiversity management plans, which seek to avoid and where not possible, mitigate impacts. And finally, I think there's a new products coming on the market, both internationally within Indonesia, which because of this low, so these ultramafic soils are low in sort of critical nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and they're high in nickel, cobalt, stuff that sort of stunt growth more. So that's the main issue. So the way it's typically addressed is fertilizer, chemical fertilizers. That's really not ideal from various different reasons, cost, and soon where we're going to be subject to inclusion of scope 3 emissions, those chemical fertilizers from those chemical plants are not going to be helpful for our emission profile. So there are new products within Indonesia internationally that are basically organic-based substances that regenerate the oil. So actually, as opposed to just adding fertilizer as a short-term fix that you need to keep doing, and essentially over time, you're not helping the productivity of that soil, you're just masking that. The soil regeneration products typically developed from organic that sort of start those microbial activities within the soil itself that is able to regenerate and produce the nutrients that they need, which is a much better solution than both from a cost and a long-term sustainability perspective of increasing the fertility of these nickel laterite soils that we have. Aquatic resource and ecology, obviously we, as an industry as a whole, but including nickel mining, we have a great deal of effluent discharges associated from our mine sites, from waste storage facilities, principally tailings sites, and from processing plants, which ultimately could have impacts to water quality and freshwater and marine ecosystems. So those management of those mine site effluents, tailings associated discharges, and processing facilities, we need to manage those quite closely. And within that water quality aspect, Indonesian regulations are based on dissolved metal content, which is actually a reasonable proxy for toxicity. But there's no further consideration of speciation of the actual toxicity on a sort of site-specific basis. And Chris touched on that there's a little bit more to nickel toxicity than purely the concentration of dissolved nickel in a water body. And the opportunities here is really getting really well designed and implemented baseline assessments to be able to predict impacts, monitor environmental management performance, etc., subsequent production. And ultimately, more science-based, site-specific standards, perhaps, as many of you know, the toxicity of nickel is dependent on other aspects of the site-specific aspects, such as the hardness of the water, the total organic carbon content of the water, which have an impact. Now, some jurisdictions have hardness corrected standards, but those aspects are not typically applied in Indonesia. And I think there's an opportunity to introduce more science-based approaches that really get more to the heart of site-specific toxicity of nickel from our various different areas within Indonesia. On human health, obviously that's a major focus, and we're seeing the potential impacts on human health of water from various different media, water, air, soil, food. The involvement in communities, it requires that when you're obviously dealing with humans, it's much more complicated than taking a water sample. So in conducting the studies, a prerequisite of that is building awareness and trust within our communities. Health studies are very complicated, and communication on those are very, very important. And it's a complicated science. So diverse cumulative exposure, it really requires skilled specialists and experts to look at the health effects of nickel in these various environments. Now, there are opportunities for us in implementing more rigorous community health studies and risk assessments. Also, basically, most companies have emergency preparedness, which includes communities, but obviously integrating health assessment, health management, which is an important part of that, more than just beyond road accidents, etc. Toxicity assessment and integrating that into our emergency response plans, emergency plans, which involve our communities and our employees, most of whom come from the local communities. So just to wrap up on those, we all recognize, I think Chris mentioned, half of the world's supply of nickel now comes from Indonesia. So we've become a critical supplier to the global energy transition. This does come, understandably, with global pressure and expectations. We need to show as an industry that we are improving our ESG performance, and are avoiding and mitigating particular impacts on environment and human health, which is often raised concerns about Indonesian nickel mining and processing. And I think going forward, there's real risk, there's a real need for science-based environmental human assessments, so that we can better and more effectively identify those risks and manage those. So I think we all recognize we're in a unique time for Indonesia, and we hold a central stage in the world for nickel. I think it's incumbent on us as an industry to recognize and to work together to become a supplier of choice to them through a much more rigorous demonstration of responsible sourcing of the minerals. Thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation. Back over to Chris.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ali. I think you shared, you covered a lot of ground for us. We see many areas of overlap with the areas of interest, areas of research, and regulatory implementation that we're active in. So I do see, a really good opportunity for an interesting discussion after we get through the next three brief presentations by my NiPERA colleagues. And the very first one will be introduced and led by Dr. Samuel Buxton, who will talk about nickel and human health. So Sam, once the slides are up, the floor is yours.
All right, Chris. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you, Emily. And if I could have control now, that would be, thank you. Thank you, Emily. So I'm happy to start off with the NiPERA presentations. And I'm going to, in the next brief minutes, talk about the human health hazard assessments, specifically of nickel. So to manage the risk that are associated with any chemical, it's important that we first know and characterize the hazards that are associated with that chemical, assess how people are exposed to that chemical, and then conduct a robust risk characterization. My colleagues will touch on these steps in the risk assessment process later, so I'll not go into details. However, in the next brief presentations, I want to focus my attention on the hazard assessments associated with nickel. So nickel metal and nickel compounds, which hereafter I'll refer to as nickel substances, are classified in different jurisdictions for different human health hazards. We at NiPERA, we have a lot of data on the human health hazards that are associated with nickel substances. It's important, therefore, that we understand these human health hazards of nickel substances so that we can protect workers and the general public, whilst also harnessing the many benefits that nickel substances offer to our modern world. So this slide lists some of the human health hazards that are been previously observed in humans or in animals. So the nickel, the health hazard effects of nickel substances have only been observed with some nickel substances, not with every nickel substance. It is important, therefore, to note that in nickel mining, processing, and using operations, where appropriate controls exist to limit nickel exposures, this health effect may not be observed. To understand the health hazards of nickel, we must understand, therefore, what drives nickel toxicity. So that is what I want to touch on in the next few slides. Answer the question, what really drives nickel toxicity? Well, one important driver is the bioavailability of nickel at the site of toxicity. Specifically, the nickel 2+ ion, which is released at site of toxicity, is considered to be responsible for the toxicity of nickel substances. So all nickel substances, whether they come from sulfide ores or from laterite ores, release this nickel 2+ ion. However, the release of this nickel 2+ ion differs between different nickel substances, with water-soluble nickel substances known to release more of the nickel 2+, and the water-insoluble oxidic and metallic releasing the least amount of this nickel 2+. We know that there are various factors that affect the bioavailability of nickel substances. These factors include exposure routes, and there are three main exposure routes of concern: dermal, oral, and inhalation. Other factors include tissue deposition and tissue retention, which are more important for inhalation routes of exposure, and then the particle size. So understanding these factors are important to potentially limit toxicity, even where exposure has occurred. Another important factor to understand that drives nickel toxicity is the limit or threshold of nickel ion at target sites. If the nickel 2 plus ion that is released at target sites is below the limit for effect or the threshold that is in the green area shown in this graph, that effect in question will not be observed. However, if sufficient amounts of the nickel 2 plus ion are released above this threshold or limit for effect, that is in the red area of the graph, the effect in question will be observed. We at NiPERA, we have, through our extensive decades of research and in publications, established that nickel toxicity is associated with thresholds, and this has been accepted by some regulators and used in risk assessment. So I'll, in the next slide, turn my attention to focus briefly on respiratory cancer as an example to emphasize the points that I have raised so far. So only respiratory cancers have been observed in workers who were exposed in the past to very high levels of nickel substances, in addition to other metals and non-metallic substances, mainly from sulfidic ore operations. These cancers were not observed when the exposures were reduced below 0.1 milligram per cubic meter. And these respiratory cancers have also not been observed when workers were exposed predominantly to nickel metal. The information we have so far therefore indicates that respiratory cancers have not also been observed in laterite operations. However, we need more robust epidemiological data from laterite ore operations to understand this better. So similar to the human observations, respiratory cancers in animal studies have only been observed with some nickel substances after exposures, after the exposure limits were exceeded. The animal studies have not shown that respiratory cancers to soluble, that there are respiratory cancers to soluble nickel or nickel metal, and cancers in other sites beside the nasal, the nose, and then the lungs have not been observed. Therefore, we can conclude that the respiratory cancers observed in workers with the high exposures in the past and in the animals are associated with thresholds. And in current operations globally, where nickel exposures are controlled, you will not expect to see these cancers. I'll conclude here and in the next slide by stating that the overwhelming body of evidence that we have shows us that we can protect against the human health effects that may be associated with nickel substances. We can do this by knowing and managing the risk through minimizing exposures to workers and the community, and also by complying with robust industrial hygiene and regulatory standards that have been established in various jurisdictions. So we at NiPERA and the Nickel Institute, because of our decades of experience and expertise, we have numerous resources available to the public or upon request that can help understand the health hazards associated with nickel substances and also help to conduct robust risk assessments. These resources include fact sheets, examples of which are shown on the slide here, and technical guidance documents like this workplace guide. Thank you. I will turn it over to my colleague, Emily, at this moment.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. I just want to point out again that that we do have the Q&A open. So if you do have questions for any of the presenters, to please pop those in the Q&A tab. And I am seeing that we do have a number of attendees, and I know many of them are very smart and intelligent and probably have a number of questions. So again, this is your opportunity to become part of the program. So please don't hesitate. We will not call your name out. We'll just simply introduce the question. So back to you, Emily.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So we just heard from Sam about the human health effects of nickel, and I'll shift gears and I'll be talking about the environmental concerns associated with nickel mining in Indonesia. And the first question may be, why are we concerned with environmental protection? And Dr. Sahami addressed these questions in his previous presentation, but there are a number of reasons why we need to be concerned with environmental protection. From the company side, there are fulfillment of regulatory requirements, for instance, required permitting and fulfillment of regulations in order to operate. There's also pressures from financiers and consumers on good ESG practices and also increasing transparency in supply chain. Compliance with responsible sourcing frameworks require demonstration of environmental protection. And of course, there's always general concerns about community and ecosystem health. So we need to be concerned with environmental protection, but environmental protection isn't just one thing. We need to understand and protect against water and soil contamination, air contamination, biodiversity loss, deforestation, and we even have to think about climate change and how climate change may impact environmental protection in the future. So starting off with a very basic question, how does nickel get into the environment? Well, nickel is naturally occurring, so nickel is in the Earth's crust, so it's been here all along, but it gets into what we would consider environmental compartments like soil, water, and air from natural processes, for instance, weathering and erosion from rocks, volcanoes, and other natural sources. But there are also human sources that get nickel into the environment, and one of the main ones is from nickel mining and manufacturing operations. And this can happen in a number of ways. This can be from runoff from mine sites or discharges from operations, waste and tailings leaching, and even air or dust from nickel operations. This can cause deposition of nickel in other areas like water and soil. There are other human sources of nickel to the environment, things like fossil fuel combustion, the application of fertilizer onto soils, and even products in commerce. But why are we concerned with nickel getting into the environment if it's already there? Well, it's important to understand that nickel getting into the environment can cause water or soil contamination, which can lead to different issues in different environmental compartments. So for instance, nickel in fresh water can impact food resources. So the access to fish or other food resources, clean water access, and it can impact community health. We know that marine ecosystems are often the home to ecologically and economically important species like corals. And many nickel operations occur on coastlines for shipping and transport. So these can be areas of high nickel exposures. We need to be concerned about sediments because nickel in freshwater or marine waters can go into the sediments and they can reside there. So having good sediment quality is important for good overlying water ecology. And then finally, soils also receive nickel from a number of different sources, and exposure to nickel creates concerns about food quality as well as community health. So it's important to measure and monitor nickel and other metals and other parameters in these different compartments, because in and around mining operations, so that we can understand, we can get a baseline, and then we can understand if there are changes in the concentrations of nickel in and around these compartments. And the reason being is because elevated levels of nickel in water, soil, and sediments can cause toxic effects to organisms. So we actually have a very large amount of data for nickel, and we understand a lot about the impacts of nickel on different organisms. So for instance, we have a nickel ecotoxicity database with 161 different freshwater species. So this is a very large collection of data. We also have quite a bit in the marine compartment for soil and sediment. So we have a good understanding of how nickel impacts a lot of different organisms. It's really important to note that the nickel ecotoxicity database comes from data typically from standard tests run with standardized methodologies, and the tests are screened for reliability and relevance. So in order to understand and compare nickel toxicity, we have to follow certain guidelines to collect these data. And when we do this, this allows us to see trends and understand which species and which organisms may be more sensitive to nickel or less sensitive to nickel. So I just provided an example here. In freshwater, we recognize that certain organisms like freshwater snails and vascular plants tend to be more sensitive to nickel, while on the flip side, we know that frogs and fish are less sensitive to nickel. In the marine compartment, things like sea urchins and crustaceans tend to be more sensitive to nickel. Things like corals and marine fish tend to be less sensitive. So this tells us more about what to expect when nickel gets into these environments. However, it's very hard to put these risks into context without doing an environmental risk assessment. So we might say, how much nickel is safe at my site? How much nickel is too much? And we cannot answer those questions without more information. And what we can do is, if we have information about nickel exposures, so measurements and monitoring data for different sites in question, and then we have information about nickel effects in certain regions, we can use the appropriate tools that we have developed to perform risk characterization. And so NiPERA has worked for the last 40 years building these exposure and effects data sets, as well as developing tools that allow us to perform these risk characterizations. So just very briefly, the risk assessment, the environmental risk assessment procedure would be first doing an exposure assessment. This would be the measurement of metals and other components in the water and the sediment and the soils in and around the mining operations. We would do an effects assessment using high quality ecotoxicity data for the site. And then from there, we could do a risk characterization. This would evaluate the sources of risk. It would quantify the probability of risk, and it would identify the uncertainties. So what we can do from there, this can inform us about the appropriate environmental management measures. So what we need to do to protect the site, and also what goals we would want for specific sites or operations or regions. So one example of a risk management measure would be developing environmental standards or water quality standards that would be protective of a certain water body or a certain site. And it's important to note that the current Indonesian standards for metals are not useful in this context because they're not based on the most current ecotoxicity data or concepts. So this would be an area, this would be a data gap where we would continue to develop more knowledge in order to develop more up-to-date standards and allow for a more complete risk characterization and implementation of risk management. So we have done quite a bit of work in Indonesia and the Philippines region in order to develop these tools and these data for the Southeast Asia, Melanesia regions. In 2014 to 2020, we, NiPERA, undertook a research program in order to look at the nickel sources, exposures, and toxicity in Indonesia, Philippines, and New Caledonia. So our general findings were that nickel exposures were resulting from nickel mining, smelting, and refining in these areas, and they often occurred near waterways and coasts. The exposure assessment told us that nickel can be released into the environment from site runoff, from tailings discharges, runoff and seepage from the disposal or storage of sites for waste materials, and also as dust from stack and fugitive emissions. We also undertook an effects assessment because we were missing some key data about some tropical species that were needed to get a better understanding about toxicity in these regions. And so we were able to develop new data for these species and compare the sensitivity to data that existed in other temperate regions. And so all of this put together enabled us the tools and the building blocks to do site-specific environmental risk assessments in Indonesia. So we will continue to develop these tools and develop the data in order to make site-specific assessments available. Now I want to switch gears briefly to talk about biodiversity. And we've already heard how important biodiversity is to Indonesia. Obviously, it has huge ecological importance as one of the world's hotspots for biodiversity. And this includes not only the marine areas, but also the rainforest and the lakes and rivers. They're home to many endemic species like coral and sharks, but others as well. And we're still learning a lot about biodiversity in these regions. So it's something that is still being explored and the knowledge base is still growing. But we do know that biodiversity assessment is required for many due diligence and responsible sourcing frameworks. For instance, the copper mark, the nickel mark, IRMA, RMI, ASI. So we need to be able to assess a baseline for biodiversity and also to assess changes in biodiversity. We know that there are threats to biodiversity from mining and manufacturing. One of the main ones is habitat degradation, and we talked about the physical footprint of mining areas. There's a strong correlation between nickel production and deforestation and habitat degradation. But there's also an important factor to consider, which is changes in the landscape. So fragmentation of habitats, where this could change the movement patterns of different animals. And of course, we still need to consider that the introduction of physical and chemical stressors can also lead to loss of biodiversity. For instance, runoff from sites can lead to degradation of water quality or soil habitats. So we can look at the biodiversity mitigation and conservation hierarchy. This is a framework that helps us address the impacts of development and activities on biodiversity. And it includes the following steps. So there's four things that we can do to mitigate and conserve biodiversity. This starts with wherever possible, to refrain and avoid biodiversity loss. So this would be to identify high priority areas and consider these areas for protection. We would also look to reduce or minimize the environmental impact of the mining that's occurring. Next, we would look to restore or remediate the degraded land and water and ensure landscape connectivity. And finally, the final step would be to renew or to offset. And this would be the new ecosystem creation or rewilding. So these are the steps that we would want to look at when we're considering how to mitigate or conserve biodiversity. Finally, I want to talk about environmental concerns associated with nickel mining and climate change. We know that climate change is happening. We know that climate change will impact both environmental exposures and environmental effects. This would be both physical and chemical environmental changes that could present additional hazards to ecosystems. For instance, for an example, we know that in tropical regions, increased temperatures or intensity or frequency of rainfall will increase metals releases and the risk of mining infrastructure failures. So changes in weather patterns, this can change how much metal is getting into systems, how the organisms react to the metals. And it also just in general increases our uncertainty about the projections we make for environmental risk assessment. So it makes us more uncertain about things that we know currently. It's harder to predict in the future. So climate change is another area that we need to be thinking about when we are doing our environmental risk assessments. My final slide is conclusions for the environment. These are messages that I want to leave you with. The first one is that chemical contamination and deforestation are important drivers for environmental degradation and biodiversity loss. However, good and early planning can reduce or avoid some of these issues. So the better you are at thinking about these things in advance and planning, the less problems that you will have down the road. Also, data and tools exist in order to develop generic environmental risk assessments in Indonesia and the Philippines, but we need site-specific exposure data in order to do a risk characterization and develop risk management at the site or operations level. And this is an area where there are data gaps. And another data gap is relevant to the Indonesian standards and how those are developed. We also need to consider the impact of other metals and other stressors when we're doing an environmental risk assessment. I focused only on nickel, but we know that chromium is also occurring in these systems. And we also have to think about other physical stressors like high solids loading that may cause stress to organisms as well. Responsible sourcing frameworks require environmental and biodiversity consideration. So if we want to comply with responsible sourcing frameworks, we need to be thinking about environmental and biodiversity considerations. And finally, when I speak about the environment, I'm talking about different compartments and different organisms, but the environment also should consider effects to surrounding communities. And that leads to our next presentation. Dr. Kate Heim will talk about nickel and community and community health.
Hello, everyone. Nice to have my turn now, and thank you very much for Dr. Schlekat, Dr. Buxton, and Dr. Garman for the nice background information that sets up my talk very well. I'll expand on some of the information that they talked about and go into a little bit more detail on the risk assessment aspect. So if we just look at what the basic steps are of risk assessment, that this is a slide that Sam also used, and he covered hazard assessment very well. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the terms of community risk assessment, that then I'll also get into the exposure assessment so that we can talk about risk. We've been saying risk for a little while in these other presentations, but really what that means is we want to look at the amount of exposure, and we want to look at how much of something needs to be, in this case, obviously nickel substances, is needed to cause the effect, and then compare those to get a risk calculation or to characterize the risk. And then by knowing those things, then we can say, well, how do we manage that risk, which usually means decreasing exposure in these cases. So I want to clarify a couple things here before I get going too much further into my talk. One is that when we talk about nickel in this presentation, as a very broad term, we're talking about inorganic nickel substances. So we're not just talking about nickel metal when we say nickel in the context of this presentation and in general in a lot of our publications. I think the other clarification to make is when we're talking about these different areas, the community risk assessment, the workplace risk assessment, the environmental risk assessment, we're talking about the nickel specific effects in this presentation, and what a lot of our research is going into the nickel specific parts, as the Nickel Institute would suggest. But there are other effects that Emily talked a little bit about, with the chromium, other metal, other stressors that come up with this and certainly need consideration. And one of the ones that we've been asked about in general is this, and has made the media in the area in Indonesia, is the coughing and the respiratory irritation. And that's not something that's specific to nickel, it's generic to mining, but this is mining, and it is mining of nickel. So that the things that as Emily said, we need to consider those other things, but what we're talking about specifically here, what I'm talking about today, what Emily's talking about, and what Sam's talking about is nickel specific within the areas within Indonesia, whether it's the community or the workplace or the environment. So just to talk just a little bit more about hazard assessment, what are the effects? What can they be? And so the effects by the different routes of exposure are oral, can cause nickel dermatitis in people that are already allergic to nickel. Some of those people, just a small portion of the population that's already allergic to nickel can have dermatitis from oral exposure, drinking or eating. The dermal nickel dermatitis, that's something that's actually a fairly common effect in the general population. Actually, the only effect from nickel that we have in the general population, usually attributed to jewelry or watches and things like that. And then inhalation, so lung fibrosis, these non-cancer effects, respiratory effects that Sam talked about, lung cancer, and then nasal cancer, so the respiratory cancer effects. And then we want to know how much of that chemical, which being nickel substances here, is needed to cause those effects. And so we do have thresholds that we look at for what will cause the nickel dermatitis by the oral route, what will cause nickel dermatitis by the skin, the dermal route, and then what values have been associated with inhalation concerns, which Sam presented about the cancer in his slides. And so this specific part, the hazard assessment, does not go into exposure. It's just saying, what are the effects that can happen? And then for those specific effects, how much of nickel substances, the specific nickel substances, are needed. And as Sam said, that will differ. It will be those thresholds, those limits for toxicity will be different for the different substances because they release different amounts of nickel. And so for the environment, we're also looking at what those effects can be and how much you need. And those are specific to the environmental compartments that Emily talked about: freshwater, marine, sediment, and soil. And so you do have the same kind of hazard information as the worksite hazard assessment. And because these hazards are going to be identified, what they can do is going to be the same. How much they require to cause the effect is going to be the same. It's the exposure that's going to differ between your community health and your work site different exposures. And so that goes, the same is true for the human health, although we don't have species differences at the sites like you do in Indonesia. Like the human health effects hazard assessment, we have very good information, and we don't need more regional information on the hazard information. But that is needed for the environmental side of things. So the, as I just said, I already talked about the part in the orange box here that the exposures will differ between the occupational site or the occupational area, the workers, and the site itself for the environment, where you have, you know, within the area of the refineries or the mining land, right where the activity is happening, you'll certainly have higher exposures than you will have in the surrounding or nearby communities. And so that is what really causes the difference in your risk assessment results. And you can see here, it's just the difference is in the exposure assessment need to be looked at for all the routes of exposure and all the compartments, environmental compartments. So now that we have the hazard information and we have the exposure information, we don't have them yet, but when you get them, when we have them, to determine the risk, you need to look at the amount of exposure divided by the threshold or the limit of toxicity. And if you have that value is greater than 1, which means your exposure is more than your toxicity limit, that's your red area that Sam was talking about before up here. And the effects are possible or may occur. If it's less than 1, which means your toxicity limit is more than your exposure, then your effects are unlikely, which is down in this lower green area. And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about risk characterization. And I just use this number. So if 5 is the exposure and 10 is the toxicity limit, then you wouldn't have risk. You would have, the effects would be unlikely. And then if we look at what goes into these values, it's not simply, you know, a threshold. You get a number for an animal testing and you don't use that number. There are assessment factors and uncertainty factors to say, well, if it's a different animal, what if it's, you know, different things to calculate there for uncertainty within the numbers. And one of the ways that can be helped to reduce those uncertainty factors is to have more information, whether it's hazard information or exposure information, to get to more exact numbers for your hazard or your exposure. And so I think the your thresholds I just have down in this lower boxes, your thresholds will be compared to your exposure for humans for each human health effect and each route of exposure, which is very important because the effects can differ by the route of exposure and the thresholds can be different for the route of exposure. And the same goes for the environment and the different compartments. So as I said briefly in the previous slide, you need additional exposure information to have more accurate information to determine what the source of the risk is. So within risk management, you want to know how can you reduce the risk, and usually that's by decreasing your exposure. But if you don't have enough exposure information, you won't know how to decrease the exposure. You won't know what the source is of the highest exposure that will affect your risk value and be able to lower the risk. Let's see. Oh, sorry. There was a little bit of a delay and I moved. So just to kind of, you know, capture this on the community level, when we look at oral exposure, so eating or drinking is your primary ways for oral exposure. Your local sources would be food or drinking water. And the effect, as I noted before, would be nickel allergic dermatitis. But I would say the amounts that you would most likely get in the community area would probably be too low, but we don't know that till we measure it. So certainly the exposure part is important. If you look at the dermal, there could be, if it's in water, then it could be bathing water or it could be contact with soil. So that's your skin contact. And the effect would be nickel allergic contact dermatitis, which again, the amounts are not likely to be high enough to cause that kind of effect, but that's why the exposure needs to be measured. So to confirm that as part of the risk assessment, the community risk assessment. For inhalation, the local sources would be air. And it's important to note that, as you see here, only cancer and the non-cancer effects are only for inhalation. You don't get those effects by any kind of absorption from dermal or oral exposure. It's only from inhalation. And then at the bottom, the environment, of course, you would have whatever gets put into the freshwater, marine, and sediment and soil is what you would be concerned about in terms of that exposure within those compartments. So just to wrap up here, the hazard information for human health is already available and won't differ between regions. So we have that information, but what we need is the regional and site-specific for occupational parts. We need that exposure information in order to do the risk assessment. In Indonesia, regional hazard assessment information is needed for the environmental effects, which Emily already talked about in some detail. And then just cannot stress it enough, the exposure information for both is needed for the local communities to accurately determine the risk. And if those values are not available, then very cautious values with a lot of uncertainty factors and models will be put into place or will be used and will definitely overestimate risk because they're going to be very conservative in their estimates. And finally, risk management will not be as effective without knowing the amount of the and where it's coming from, the sources of the exposure that could increase that risk. With that, I think that's it. So thank you very much. And I welcome any questions that we'll get to in the moderated session here shortly.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody, to Kate, Emily, and Sam, and maybe if I can ask you all to come back, and Ali as well. So we've have indeed received a number of questions. Thank you, everybody. Some of these are specific, some that we can formulate into our discussion. There's some high-level ones. So, for example, somebody asked if the slides for our presentation will be made available. Yes, we can make those available. We'll have our email addresses available, and you can certainly contact us. We'll also, as I mentioned, aim to put this on the Nickel Institute YouTube channel, so that the whole recording will be available for your perusal. But now I think, yeah, I'd like to just get into some discussion, and there are some of these questions that definitely overlap with all of the presentations. So I'm just going to start with one, and I'm going to bounce around a little bit, so keep on your toes. So one, we did have a little bit of a focus in the discussion, in Sam's presentation, for example, on the role of animal data in making judgments about effects and risk. There was a question that related to the availability of more or less epidemiological data. So I'm going to paraphrase here. So have there been studies on reproductive toxicity, for example, or any other potential effects in humans with exposure from nickel mining or refining in workers or communities in the nearby area? And then as a follow-up to that, I think maybe you'll let Sam tackle that part. And then maybe for Ali, the follow-up for that was, if so, are there specific studies that have been performed along those lines in Indonesia specifically? So Sam, maybe I can just ask you to begin, and then Ali can finish up.
Yeah, so I'll touch on the human health studies for reproductive toxicity, and then maybe another effect, and then make a general statement about how informative animal studies are So yes, there's been some studies in the past. So going back to, for example, 1990, a group of women who were working in nickel refineries and were exposed to nickel had spontaneous abortions and other developmental effects. Now, this publication suggested that this may be due to their exposure to nickel. However, there were a lot of confounding factors identified in this study. So a follow-up, more extensive study was conducted to address the shortcomings in this study. And what the conclusion from this more extensive study was that nickel exposures in these women is not associated with reproductive or developmental effects. So we know that the levels of exposures that women or people in general who work in nickel mining and processing factories are exposed to is not sufficient to cause repro or developmental effects. However, nickel substances are classified, at least in the EU, for reproductive effect. And that is because in animal studies, there were effects that were seen. So there's a case where animal studies may be informative, but not necessarily complete or full in getting an understanding of the effects that are seen in humans. So I always advocate that when you see a publication that states that this effect is associated with nickel in animal studies, my question is it really observed in humans, or is it relevant to the levels that people are exposed to in the workplace?
Sam, can I just
yeah.
add on a little bit to that, if you don't mind?
Please.
Yeah, and I would just say, so as Sam's saying, in humans, and then of course you want to know if the doses are sufficient. And then that particular study that Sam's talking about, that they did, the second study where they didn't find the effects, those were done with in an area that had very high doses. So doses we don't see anymore, and they didn't see any effects. So it's not just that they were low doses. This was an area, it was in Russia, where they had a lot of women in the workforce there, and a lot of very high historic exposures to these women. And so that is we consider a good quality and relevant study for this. And then for the classifications, it's only some substances, it's only the soluble ones, it's not the insoluble ones, just to kind of, we talked about, different substances with different effects. So very good answer. Thanks, Sam.
So, and then, I think this is, really good. Thank you both. And then I think this then, the follow-up question then is, are we aware of any studies like this within Indonesia, or, or is it, has the rate of increase of nickel production, has that just taken off so fast that we haven't had the opportunity to make those reliable measurements?
So is that Chris for Ali? Dr.
Yeah, that's
Ali,
for
right?
Ali.
Yeah,
Okay.
thanks. Yeah, so exactly that, Chris, is obviously there's a lot of ecotoxicological expertise in Indonesia in an academic institution, but historically a lot of that has been focused on arsenic, mercury, things to do with gold mining, which has a much longer tradition in Indonesia with the artisanal mining we're aware of. Given, as you just said, news that nickel's the upstart, I'm not aware of any yet, but I see these sort of fora and these interactions as an opportunity to start that discussion, which we very much need. I think another question was, that whole toxicological human health effects of those other contaminants associated with sulfidic deposits are much more understood because of a long history of it. And I think this would be the opportunity. These questions are being asked more recently about nickel. So I'm certainly not aware of any specific that level work on nickel up to now within Indonesia. But this is exactly the reason to have these discussions, because there's obviously a huge need for that going forward with a new focus on nickel.
Yeah. May I, Chris, also, I'm aware of time, but may I also quickly add, I could not agree with Ali more. For human health, for example, we have a few studies of workers in New Caledonia, and that is where I indicated that there is no suggestion that mining in laterite operations is associated with increase in respiratory cancer, right? But the statistical power for those studies are very low. They date way back, and so we need, to your point, Ali, we need more comprehensive, up-to-date studies.
Yeah, thank you both. I want to, I do see somebody with their hand raised. We are going to focus now on the questions that we have in the Q&A. And there are a couple that I think are relevant first for Emily. And then I think Ali can have an opportunity to echo on these ones as well. So, so the first one, specifically refers to Ali's talk. So it's Dr. Sahami mentioned that nickel environmental management is increasing in Indonesia, and the environmental water quality criteria are based on dissolved nickel. And so it's exactly the question if Indonesia has any specific plans to apply bioavailability-based approaches into management. And then related to that, a couple of questions about the availability of high quality ecotoxicity data for like indigenous species and also bioavailability relationships. So maybe Emily, maybe you can begin the answer to that, and then Ali, if you want to follow up on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chris. And thanks for the nice questions. What we know about nickel is that we have a very large database in fresh and marine water. And one of our goals of doing the nickel tropical environmental risk assessment program was to really understand if the sensitivities and the trends that we're seeing in other parts of the world held true in areas like Indonesia and the Philippines. And so we were able to generate new toxicity data on species that were found in and around Philippines and Indonesia, and develop new data sets. And in general, what we found was that there were similarities in terms of the sensitivities that we would expect from both tropical to temperate regions. There weren't very large differences. The tropical species weren't very much more sensitive or insensitive to nickel. And so this was an important finding and allows us to apply some of these bioavailability tools that have been developed in other parts of the world in these regions. So we do have a specific data set for Indonesia, and I would encourage you to take a look at the paper that we published in 2020, Garman et al. 2021, and that will tell you a little bit more about what species we tested and what were the findings for the outcomes of those studies.
Thanks, Emily. And I guess then the question for Ali is if we're aware of any frameworks that are being developed that are taking into account concepts like bioavailability and just I'll add one thing, one caveat is that we're working with global governments literally around the world, and they are not working very swiftly. Let's put it that way. So so yeah, I think it's a high bar to reach. Let's put it that way. But anything that you can offer, Ali, to that point.
Right. Yeah. So that's an important point to note, that these sort of science-based bioavailability types, toxicologically based standards are not the norm. The norm globally is just some numerical standards. In Indonesia, we have a numerical standard for discharge and then numerical standards for the receiving environment. We recently, as most Indonesian participants here will know, we recently had new regulations issued under what was called the Job Creation Act or the Omnibus Act, but they were essentially the old regulations repackaged in the new one. And I'm certainly not aware of any initiatives to start looking at more science-based standards. But I think, again, I think there's an opportunity, and as Chris said, this will be a period of engagement. Essentially in Indonesia, that would have to be through the academic institutions where majority of the experts in Indonesia reside, who also act as experts for government bodies. And so I think there will be opportunities, again, you know, as we go forward, given the really important focus on nickel right now. I think that would be the impetus. It won't be a short aspect because it will be a period of socialization, awareness, because it's something relatively new for us here. So not aware of any existing initiatives, but it's something that I'm hopeful that can be instigated to get more meaningful numbers, to get more meaningful. What does that mean? You know, and as we talked about, you know, the same concentration of nickel in hard water and high total organic water would be much less toxic than the same concentration in soft low organic matter. So those are the concepts that are very important to build in, because the effective toxicity on a site-specific basis is what we're really after, as opposed to a generic one that could be right, but there's a big element of change. So by that argumentation, but by the science that's developing, including all the work that's been done at NiPERA and other academic institutions, and this need to get a better handle on really our toxicity, our impacts from nickel, I'm hoping that that's impetus enough to start that process in Indonesia.
Chris, I have one more point to add, is that you mentioned that we work with governments around the world in developing bioavailability-based standards. One such government is Australia and New Zealand, that we've worked together to develop standards, but we're also developing in conjunction with those governments implementation guidance. And this will be a practical guidance that will help practitioners to implement the bioavailability correction in order to comply with the bioavailability-based environmental quality standards. And it's probable that the guidance will be applicable to Indonesia and the Southeast Asia region. So that should be forthcoming in 2025. We'll also be holding a workshop in order to better describe those outcomes. So that is forthcoming as well.
Great, thank you both. And now there are a couple of questions that cover a shared theme, and that is one of data quality. And specifically, you know, we've mentioned several times, you know, Kate has pointed out that we need to have exposure data in our risk assessment frameworks to make appropriate conclusions. And similarly, with epidemiological data or ecotoxicity data, you know, I guess the question is, how do we ascertain the reliability and the quality of these data, be it exposure data on the one hand or effects data on the other hand? And I think I can just point out that the data that Emily has referred to that are recognized by the Australia and New Zealand frameworks have gone through exhaustive reliability and quality checks. So that is one thing that most jurisdictions have, and it's something that we have developed on our own for specifically looking at nickel ecotoxicity and human toxicity data. But specifically, just, if anybody can say what standards are available for establishing quality assurance in terms of collecting like exposure data, for example.
Yeah, so I think I can speak to this a little bit. I mean, one of the things is to look at what the methods are used for exposure data. In Sam's presentation towards the end, there was a description of the workplace guide, or a picture of the workplace guide. And one of the reasons that we have that workplace guide is to talk about, practices within there, but also what kind of exposure assessment methods, I believe, are in there, or considerations and references to the specific methods. And so I think the methods themselves are a big part of the quality of the and relevance of the exposure measurements, or exposure assessment data. And then if you look at another part is looking at how many people have been exposed, so that the numbers that you have, and then the specific areas of wherever it is, if it's representative, and then, one of the single biggest things that we run into all the time with human health that's very difficult to do is looking at what kind of other exposures are there that might be getting in the way of the hazard assessment. So it's not just the nickel substance, what other kind of exposures are there as well, I think are the kind of the big things for human health. Sam, I don't know if you want to add anything in there.
Perfect answer, Kate. The only thing I'll add is that exposure assessment in general falls under the purview of industrial hygienists or occupational hygienists. Will be very important for stakeholders, especially those who are on the ground, mining in Indonesia and other regions, to have, experts like industrial hygienists, occupational hygienists on board to be able to, conduct such a exposure assessment. And we as an association, the Nickel Institute, we have an industrial hygienist who is tapped into the Indonesian industrial hygiene community. So he's able to provide information and connections or contact where needed.
Yeah, Sam, and I was going to point out, that our colleague Stephen Verpeil, he's also a member of many industrial hygiene standard setting organizations like ASTM and other organizations, and ISO specifically, yeah, and all of those are recognized in the guidance that Kate referred to and that Sam presented earlier. So I think I guess the message is that there are protocols that have to be followed, and it's important to ensure that those standards are followed, those ISO standards, those ASTM standards, in order to establish the validity and the quality of those data. And Ali, I mean, you mentioned the importance of establishing baselines, right? And I'm just guessing that standards like those would be part of that that baseline establishment. Yeah. Okay, so
sorry, I was on mute.
Yeah.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Yeah.
Chris, that actually makes me think of another aspect of it, is the baselines. When you're looking at something that's naturally occurring like nickel, you want to look at a population within the refinery that's not exposed to those other things. So office workers is a frequent other population that's used, because they could have nickel from their jewelry on their skin. They could have, they have nickel in their body from food and water, whatever sources, even if they don't live in the community. So really taking into account kind of using them as controls or the baseline to eliminate whatever that background is, since nickel is always there for us in some way, shape, or form.
Well, I think the number of questions are beginning, the rate with which they were coming in is decreased, but there are a couple more that I would like to touch upon, but we may not need to go through to the end of the hour. But here's an interesting one that I think, again, crosses the boundaries of human health concerns and environmental concerns, and that is the nickel in food chains. So is there, any, and Kate mentioned the importance of the diet as a route of exposure at the community level. And it is something that we often see questioned about in ecological risk assessment. Specifically, the question is, do we need to be concerned about nickel acting as a biomagnifying substance? So Kate, maybe first, if you can talk just generally about nickel in the human health context, where that might be important, and yeah, just I'll hand that off to you.
So just to clarify what you're asking, Chris, nickel in the human health context within the community and sources, is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Right.
And what we know about it and what we don't know about it, and
Sure.
specifically, I guess, within Indonesia.
Right. Well, I mean, we know that Indonesia has, higher nickel levels in the soils. That's why we're mining it there. So naturally, even without the human sources of refining and mining, there are going to be higher levels in the water and higher levels in food. And so there's already an underlying amount there. To the best of my knowledge, in the environment side of things, I'm skipping around a little, I'm sorry. On the environment side of things with naturally occurring, we know there's adaptation. And so the organisms that are there have adapted to those nickel levels. And so you can't just use, the same levels with organisms in other parts of the world that have low nickel in the environment and the same ones in Indonesia or New Caledonia or whatever. I'm not aware of that kind of adaptation in humans, but you have to believe that they're not having those effects at whatever those concentrations are. So the question becomes, what does that mean when you have higher levels added that may come from the refineries and the mining processes? That's the part we don't know. And that's also the part we need to know, because those are the parts that we can control or may need to control or decrease, whereas we're not going to control the natural sources. So I think that's important. And then, there are other sources that are human sources that are not from nickel mining and refining, which are things around us. I mean, I mentioned the jewelry side of things. There's nickel in, appliances, stainless steels in particular. I mean, they can have 12 to 15% nickel in them, but it's how much is released. As Sam said, it's the amount of ion that's released, and that's what causes the effects, wherever that target organ may be. But if we're looking at dermatitis, which is the possible thing that consumers are exposed to regardless, but looking at stainless steels, they don't release a lot of nickel. So we know that that's a very safe use. That's why it's used for so many things. And that's why it has such a long lifetime of use, is because it resists corrosion and it's very safe.
So let me, Kate, let me just turn this question in a different direction and see if I can get to the, what I think is the concern that's being expressed. And I think this would, then lead to perhaps a remark by Emily. So, I mean, is there any evidence that, I think it may be related to the discourse in the media about forever chemicals, let's say. Do we need to be concerned that that nickel is accumulating in our body over time, for example? Is that at all a concern?
No, that's not anything that that I'm aware of. I think, it's been looked at in other things. It's it is cleared from the body. We have toxicokinetic data, which is basically data where you see what it's been in animals and how it gets through the system and how it's excreted. So it's not something like lead that accumulates in the bones and never leaves, that kind of thing. That's not what we're talking about with nickel.
That's perfect, Kate. Thank you. And then Emily, from the ecological risk assessment side.
Yeah, a few comments. We do have extensive data on bioconcentration in aquatic and terrestrial organisms. From what we understand, we don't see that nickel biomagnifies the food chain like maybe other metals do. So that doesn't tend to be a concern for biomagnification based on the data that we have. In terms of nickel, the comparison with forever chemicals, typically when we talk about forever chemicals, those are organic substances with very, very long degradation times. We know that nickel is naturally occurring. It does not degrade. It's naturally occurring in the Earth's crust. And so what it can do is can be transported to different environmental compartments. However, because it is essential for plants to grow, it doesn't have the same concerns as something like a forever chemical or an organic substance. We know that nickel is critical for functioning of plants, and it's critical for us because we eat plants. And so from my viewpoint, that's not a concern as it would be for other substances.
Great, thank you. Thank you both.
I'm
going to jump on to one last question, Kate, and
Yep.
And because I think we're almost near our closing time, and this is probably one that Emily and Ali can jointly share, because you both talked about the importance of biodiversity as it's reflected in ESG frameworks. And I guess one of the questions is, first of all, pretty high level, do all of the frameworks approach it in the same way? And then secondly, and perhaps for Ali and specifically, are the Indonesia specific issues that you identified, is there a way to capture those within your reporting to these frameworks?
Should I start? So yeah, I think if you look in a little bit more detail on those standards, IRMA, etc., they all essentially refer to the IFC's performance standard 6, which relates to biodiversity, how you go about assessing that, etc. IRMA directly references that. So they're extremely similar. And, you know, for companies such as us, which we have international lenders, that's the sort of IFC level work that we do on all our mine sites in Indonesia. So yeah, very directly applicable. I think there's standards and methodologies that can be applied everywhere, but they're particularly critical in Indonesia, given the diversity, given the amount of critical habitats we have, and those standards focus on those things, as well as the appropriate management and mitigation measures. So I think those are actually the standards that give us the tools to be able to look at those to an international standard that we follow at all of our mine sites. So yes, very applicable, and essentially all the same, you know, in a very high level of what is required in terms of approach and mitigation and management.
Great, thank you. And Emily, yep, please.
Add one note is that it's true they're quite high level, and sometimes that leads to questions about implementation and how the practices are actually done. And so that's one area that we're working towards, is to try to develop more practical guidance on how sites or assets could conduct this type of assessment, what tools are available, what monitoring, what measurements are available. So that's something that I think could use more clarification and that we're working towards.
Great. Well, yeah, I think it's probably a good enough time to wrap up, to finish our event now. So just a few remarks as we close the event. And first of all, we at NiPERA want to thank all of the attendees of the webinar. So thank you for your time, your interest and your questions. We really appreciate that. And I personally want to thank the speakers from Ali in Jakarta to my NiPERA colleagues here in North Carolina. So I think we've heard that there's really strong interest in the work that we're doing in NiPERA, and specifically to better understand the potential risks associated with nickel from the human health and environmental perspectives within the Indonesian nickel value chain. I think this was clear in the questions that we've received today, and I guess also from our other interactions with Indonesian stakeholders. And as a placeholder, and just let everybody know that we're working to develop a small event in Jakarta in late September to further explore the concepts that we explored today, and to see how we can hopefully place them into action as soon as later this year and going into next year as well. So with that, I think we are ready to adjourn. And again, please keep an eye out for the indication for where to see the video, the recording of this event. And again, once again, I just thank everybody for their time and interest. So it's a good day, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone.